The first clue that someone had stolen my land was the real estate sign standing in the middle of it. I still remember the sound my truck tires made as they rolled across the gravel road that morning. After spending nearly 3 weeks away handling business in another state, I was finally heading back to my property. 1,500 acres of rolling fields, timber, creeks, and open pasture stretched across the county. My grandfather bought the first section of that land almost 70 years earlier. My father expanded it. I spent most of my adult life maintaining it. Every fence line, every access road, every oak tree along the ridges felt familiar. That was why the bright red sign immediately caught my attention. It stood near the main entrance gate where it had absolutely no business being. Real estate available. Call for details. I slowed the truck and stared through the windshield. For a moment, I honestly thought someone had placed it there as a joke. Then I noticed a second sign farther down the road. Then a third. My stomach tightened. I pulled through the gate and drove deeper into the property. The spring air smelled of fresh grass and damp soil from a storm that had passed through 2 nights earlier. Birds scattered from the fence posts as I moved along the dirt road. The farther I drove, the worse it became. Survey stakes had appeared in multiple locations. Bright ribbons marked boundaries that did not exist. Temporary signs advertised parcels for sale. By the time I reached the main barn, confusion had already turned into concern. I stepped out of the truck and immediately noticed tire tracks from heavy equipment. Someone had been working on my land while I was gone. The barn itself was untouched, but several new markers had been installed around the surrounding fields. I walked over and pulled one from the ground. Attached to it was a laminated tag displaying parcel information. Not my parcel information. Different numbers, different descriptions, different ownership references. None of it made sense. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. That was when I found the message waiting for me. It came from the HOA President of the neighboring residential development, Karen Whitmore. The subject line simply read Community Expansion Update. Curious, I opened it. What I read made me stop walking. According to Karen, the HOA had recently completed a transaction involving acreage adjacent to their subdivision. The message congratulated residents on securing land that would support future growth, new amenities, walking trails, and increased property values. Attached were photographs from a small celebration event held only days earlier. In one of the pictures, Karen stood smiling beside a large map. I zoomed in. My pulse immediately accelerated. The highlighted acreage on that map was not adjacent land. It was my land. Hundreds of acres of it. I stared at the screen in complete disbelief. Then I looked back across the fields that my family had owned for generations. Somewhere between my departure and my return, somebody had apparently decided they could sell property that did not belong to them. And the most unbelievable part was that they seemed convinced they had already succeeded. For several minutes, I stood beside the barn staring at my phone while a cold breeze moved across the pasture. The email remained open on the screen as if reading it again might somehow make it more reasonable. It did not. The photographs showed smiling residents gathered around presentation boards, refreshments arranged on folding tables, and a large development map displaying acreage that I knew better than my own driveway. My family had worked that land for generations. I hunted there as a teenager. I repaired fences there as an adult. I paid taxes on every acre. Yet somehow an entire community had been convinced that the property belonged to someone else. I climbed back into my truck and drove straight toward the neighboring subdivision. The contrast between the two properties always felt striking. My land stretched across open fields and wooded ridges. The HOA community consisted of carefully maintained streets lined with nearly identical homes, decorative landscaping, and neighborhood signs proudly displaying community rules. As I approached the clubhouse, I noticed several banners still hanging from a recent event. One of them promoted future expansion opportunities. My jaw tightened. Inside the clubhouse, the smell of fresh coffee and carpet cleaner filled the lobby. Residents moved through the building discussing weekend plans while a television displayed community announcements. Karen Whitmore stood near a conference room speaking with several board members. She noticed me almost immediately. Her smile suggested she believed this would be a routine conversation. It disappeared when I asked a simple question. Why was my property displayed on her development map? Karen answered with surprising confidence. According to her, the HOA had acquired rights to acreage bordering the community through what she described as a verified transaction. She spoke as though the matter had already been settled beyond dispute. I asked who sold the land. She replied that legal documentation had been reviewed and approved before the purchase. When I requested copies, she informed me they were not immediately available. The more she spoke, the less sense the situation made. Karen was not behaving like someone hiding a mistake. She genuinely believed the HOA owned the property. That realization concerned me more than anything else. Mistakes can be corrected quickly. Conviction takes longer. Before leaving, I asked one final question. Had anyone contacted the actual landowner before celebrating the acquisition? A brief silence followed. Karen exchanged glances with another board member. Neither answered directly. That was answer enough. Back at my truck, I sat for several minutes reviewing county property records through public databases. Parcel numbers appeared. Ownership histories appeared. Tax assessments appeared. Every record I checked still showed my name exactly where it belonged. Nothing indicated a transfer. Nothing indicated a sale. Nothing indicated any change whatsoever. Yet signs remained planted across my fields, and an entire HOA believed it had purchased hundreds of acres. As the afternoon sun lowered across the horizon, I realized this was no longer simply a misunderstanding. Somewhere between public records, private documents, and HOA paperwork, something had gone terribly wrong. And judging by Karen's confidence, nobody in that community had any idea how serious the problem was about to become. The next morning, I drove to the county records office the moment it opened. If there was one thing I had learned during decades of managing land, it was that opinions do not matter nearly as much as paperwork. People can argue about ownership all day long. Deeds do not argue. They simply exist. The courthouse sat in the center of town exactly where it had stood for generations. The smell of old paper and polished wood greeted me as I walked through the doors. Clerks moved quietly between counters while residents handled permits, filings, and property documents. I requested every record connected to the acreage Karen claimed the HOA had acquired. Within an hour, a stack of documents sat in front of me. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Parcel maps matched what I already knew. Tax records still listed me as the owner. Historical surveys aligned perfectly with the boundaries my family had maintained for decades. Then I found something strange. One filing referenced a deed transfer connected to a parcel number that resembled mine, but was not actually mine. The difference consisted of only a few digits. Most people would never notice it. I nearly missed it myself. Curious, I requested additional records tied to that number. What appeared next immediately caught my attention. Years earlier, a small inactive parcel located several miles away had been abandoned during a complicated ownership dispute. It shared a remarkably similar identification sequence with one of my larger tracts. Somehow, somewhere, those records appeared to have been connected. The more documents I reviewed, the clearer the picture became. Someone had relied on a flawed property map. That error had then traveled through additional paperwork until an entire chain of assumptions formed around it. By lunchtime, I was no longer looking at a mystery. I was looking at a mistake. A very expensive mistake. Back at my truck, I organized copies of every relevant document and called my attorney, Richard Lawson. Richard specialized in property law and had spent decades handling land disputes across the state. When I explained what I found, he listened without interrupting. After several minutes of silence, he asked me to bring everything to his office immediately. His reaction alone told me this situation was becoming larger than I originally imagined. That afternoon, the smell of coffee filled Richard's office as we spread maps, deeds, surveys, and county filings across a large conference table. Sunlight streamed through the windows while he compared records line by line. Occasionally, he circled a section with a pen. Occasionally, he shook his head. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the documents. According to Richard, the HOA appeared to have based its entire acquisition on a chain of paperwork connected to the wrong parcel. More importantly, nobody seemed to have verified ownership through the actual recorded deed before celebrating the transaction. I expected him to be angry. Instead, he looked fascinated. Then he asked a question I had not considered. Had I ever seen the original deed from the largest section of my family's property? I told him I had copies somewhere in storage. Richard nodded slowly. The expression on his face changed. He pointed toward one of the oldest references in the file and said there might be something buried in the original records that nobody had looked at in decades. And if he was right, Karen's problem was about to become much bigger than a simple property dispute. That evening, I returned to the oldest building on the property, a weathered storage structure my grandfather built long before the neighboring subdivision even existed. The air inside carried the familiar smell of aged wood, dust, and old paper. Sunlight filtered through narrow gaps in the walls, casting thin beams across shelves filled with boxes that had not been touched in years. Somewhere in that building sat decades of family records. If Richard was correct, the answer we needed was buried in paperwork most people would have thrown away long ago. I spent hours opening boxes, sorting through survey maps, tax receipts, maintenance records, and faded correspondence. By nightfall, my hands were covered in dust, and my back ached from lifting containers. Then I found it. A heavy metal lockbox tucked behind several old filing cabinets. Inside sat a collection of original deeds, surveys, and legal documents dating back generations. Some pages were yellow with age. Others were protected inside plastic sleeves. One document immediately caught my attention. It contained the original transfer records from when my grandfather acquired the largest section of the property. Early the next morning, I carried the lockbox directly to Richard's office. We spread everything across the conference table and began reviewing the records one page at a time. For nearly 2 hours, nothing appeared unusual. Then Richard stopped. He leaned closer to one particular document and read a paragraph twice before looking up at me. The expression on his face told me he had found something important. The document contained a clause that had been recorded decades earlier when the surrounding area remained undeveloped farmland. At the time, nobody could have predicted a large residential community would eventually be built nearby. Yet the language was remarkably specific. Richard continued reading while I listened carefully. The clause established a series of land use rights and ownership protections tied to future development occurring within portions of the original property boundaries. The legal wording was complicated, but the implication was becoming obvious. A substantial portion of the modern subdivision appeared to have been constructed on land connected to rights that had never fully expired. Richard immediately requested additional archived records from the county. By afternoon, more documents arrived. Survey maps, development approvals, historical plats, old easement agreements. Piece by piece, a much larger picture emerged. The HOA had spent weeks celebrating what they believed was an expansion of their community. Meanwhile, nobody had noticed that the historical documents underlying the entire neighborhood contained restrictions and ownership provisions that had been overlooked for years. I sat quietly as Richard connected one file after another. The room grew increasingly silent. Eventually, he pushed his chair back and stared at the wall for several seconds. Then he said something I will never forget. Karen was focused on the land she thought she had acquired. She never stopped to examine the land already beneath her community. A chill moved through me despite the warm afternoon sunlight outside the windows. The mistake was no longer limited to a flawed parcel map. It was no longer limited to an improper transaction. The forgotten clause was connected to property rights affecting hundreds of homes. For decades, nobody had questioned the paperwork because nobody had needed to. Now the HOA's attempt to take my land had forced every document back into the spotlight. And the deeper we dug, the more dangerous the truth became for the people who thought they had won. For the next several days, Richard and I worked through documents that most people would have considered boring. To us, they were becoming the most important pieces of evidence in the county. Every morning began with another stack of records: development filings, historical surveys, easement agreements, title reports, county approvals. By the end of the week, the conference table in Richard's office had disappeared beneath layers of paperwork. The smell of coffee and old paper seemed permanently embedded in the room. Outside, life continued normally. Residents mowed lawns. Children rode bicycles through the subdivision. Karen continued issuing community updates celebrating future expansion plans. Nobody realized the foundation beneath those plans was already beginning to crack. Late one afternoon, Richard finally assembled the last piece of the puzzle. He placed several documents side by side and walked me through them slowly. Decades earlier, when portions of the original ranch land were sold for development, a unique legal structure had been created. The developers purchased rights to construct homes, roads, and community facilities. However, a separate ownership interest tied to underlying land control and future transfer provisions had never been fully extinguished. Over time, as builders changed, companies dissolved, and properties changed hands, everyone assumed those provisions no longer mattered. The assumption became accepted as fact. The problem was that assumptions are not legal documents. Recorded deeds are. Richard pointed to a specific section within the original agreement. The language was remarkably clear. Certain rights remained attached to the successor owner of the original tract. That successor owner was me. I sat quietly while he explained the implications. The HOA believed they had acquired land from me. In reality, their attempted transaction had triggered a legal review that exposed ownership provisions affecting the very community they governed. Then Richard delivered the statement that changed everything. According to the documents, I possessed legal leverage over property interests connected to nearly every lot within the subdivision. Not ownership of the homes themselves. Not immediate control of residents' lives. Something much more powerful. Certain transfer and land use rights that had never been properly addressed during decades of development. My first reaction was disbelief. My second reaction was concern. Hundreds of families lived there. Most had absolutely nothing to do with the HOA's actions. Richard agreed. He reminded me that the residents were not the problem. The problem was the leadership that acted without verifying ownership. We spent the next several days building a careful strategy. No public accusations. No dramatic lawsuits. No threats. Just documentation. Verification. Procedure. Every step followed established property law. Meanwhile, Karen continued acting as though the matter had already been settled. Community newsletters discussed future amenities. Expansion plans remained active. Celebration photographs continued circulating online. Watching those updates felt surreal. The HOA thought they were standing on top of a victory. They were actually standing on top of a legal fault line. By the following week, every required filing was prepared. Every supporting document had been verified. Every historical record had been authenticated. Richard placed the final folder on his desk and looked directly at me. The counterattack would not begin in a courtroom. It would begin with paperwork. And once those documents entered the official record, Karen was going to discover that the land she thought she had taken from me was only the beginning of her problem. The following week unfolded with an almost eerie sense of calm. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Residents continued their routines. Lawn crews maintained common areas. Families walked their dogs along community sidewalks. Karen Whitmore posted updates celebrating the future of the neighborhood and discussing expansion opportunities that now seemed almost surreal to me. Every time I read one of those announcements, I found myself shaking my head. She still believed she was steering the community toward a larger future. She had no idea that a completely different future was already moving through the legal system one document at a time. Richard instructed me to remain patient. No public statements. No interviews. No confrontations. Everything had to proceed through proper channels. Over several days, certified filings were submitted, historical ownership records were authenticated, and notices were prepared according to state property law requirements. It felt strange watching such a massive legal response emerge from nothing more dramatic than paperwork. Yet that was exactly how significant property disputes often unfold. Not with loud arguments. With signatures, records, and filing stamps. One afternoon, I sat in Richard's office while he reviewed the final package. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Sunlight reflected off the courthouse visible through the window across the street. Richard carefully placed the completed documents into several organized folders before looking at me with the same expression he wore whenever he was absolutely certain of something. Every step had been verified. Every reference had been checked. Every historical document had been traced back to its original recording. There would be no surprises. The facts were now stronger than any opinion. Meanwhile, the HOA continued acting as if the acquisition issue had already been resolved. Additional survey markers appeared near sections of my property. Promotional material referenced future amenities. Some residents even discussed potential walking trails and recreational areas that supposedly would occupy land they did not actually own. The deeper the illusion became, the more dramatic its eventual collapse would be. Yet I felt surprisingly calm. Months earlier, I might have reacted emotionally. Now I simply trusted the records. The documents did not care about popularity. They did not care about community politics. They only cared about ownership. Late Friday afternoon, Richard received confirmation that the filings had officially entered the public record. That moment marked the true beginning of the counterattack. Nothing visible changed immediately. No sirens. No emergency meetings. No dramatic announcements. Just a series of legal actions quietly becoming official. As the sun began setting beyond the courthouse windows, Richard smiled for the first time in days. He explained that the next stage would not involve us contacting residents. The system would do that on its own. Certain notifications, disclosures, and title reviews would begin moving through the proper channels automatically. People would start asking questions. Those questions would eventually lead back to the same documents Karen had failed to examine before claiming ownership of my land. Driving home that evening, I passed the subdivision entrance and noticed the banners promoting future expansion still hanging beside the road. They moved gently in the evening breeze beneath a sky glowing orange and gold from the setting sun. I slowed briefly and looked toward the neighborhood. Somewhere behind those streets and homes, hundreds of people were about to receive information that would completely change their understanding of who controlled the land beneath their community. And when those letters finally arrived, Karen's real problem would begin. The first letters arrived on a Tuesday morning. I did not witness the deliveries myself, but I certainly heard about them. By noon, my phone had already received several messages from residents I barely knew. Some sounded confused. Others sounded concerned. A few sounded genuinely alarmed. The notifications were not accusations or threats. They were simply disclosures generated through the legal process, now that historical ownership interests and property rights reviews had officially entered the record. For most homeowners, the language was difficult to understand. Terms like title review, underlying property interests, recorded provisions, successor rights, and historical land agreements are not exactly casual reading material. Yet one thing was immediately clear. Something significant had been discovered, and it involved the land beneath their community. The atmosphere inside the subdivision changed almost overnight. Residents who had spent weeks discussing future expansion suddenly found themselves discussing deeds and surveys. Questions spread quickly. People wanted answers. Some contacted attorneys. Some contacted title companies. Others contacted the HOA directly. That was where the real pressure began. Karen had spent weeks presenting certainty. Now she was being asked for explanations she did not have. Late that afternoon, I drove past the subdivision entrance on my way into town. The neighborhood looked exactly the same on the surface. Children played basketball in driveways. Landscaping crews trimmed hedges near the clubhouse. Yet the feeling had changed completely. Conversations stopped when people noticed unfamiliar vehicles. Small groups stood together near mailboxes comparing documents. The confidence that once surrounded the expansion project had been replaced by uncertainty. A few days later, Richard received copies of several inquiries filed by residents seeking clarification regarding ownership records and development history. None of them accused anyone of wrongdoing. They simply wanted facts. Ironically, those facts were the very things Karen should have demanded before attempting to claim my property. The most revealing moment came during a regularly scheduled HOA board meeting. Word spread quickly through the community, and attendance reached levels rarely seen before. Residents filled seats, lined walls, and stood near doorways. According to several people who attended, nearly every question focused on the same issue. How had the board approved a transaction involving land ownership without discovering the historical provisions now appearing in official records? Karen reportedly attempted to reassure everyone that the situation would be resolved. But reassurance becomes difficult when documents begin speaking louder than leadership. Meanwhile, Richard and I remained silent publicly. That was intentional. We did not need speeches. We did not need interviews. The paperwork was doing all the work for us. Every new inquiry led people back to the same historical records. Every review produced the same uncomfortable conclusion. The HOA had focused entirely on acquiring land, while overlooking the legal structure supporting the community itself. By Friday evening, another development occurred. A title specialist contacted Richard requesting access to additional archive documentation connected to the original subdivision approval process. When Richard shared the news, he sounded almost impressed. Independent professionals were now uncovering the same issues we had discovered weeks earlier. The truth no longer depended on my interpretation or Richard's opinion. Multiple experts were arriving at the same destination through entirely separate paths. As the week ended, I sat on my porch overlooking fields my family had owned for generations. The sunset painted the horizon in deep shades of orange and gold. Somewhere beyond those distant trees, Karen was still trying to contain a problem that had grown far beyond HOA politics. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I suspected she had finally started reading the documents she should have examined from the beginning. 3 days later, Karen finally requested a meeting. The invitation arrived through her attorney and contained none of the confidence that had filled her earlier emails. Richard and I met them in a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Rain tapped softly against the windows while stacks of documents covered nearly every available surface. Karen entered carrying a thick binder. The difference in her demeanor was impossible to miss. Weeks earlier, she spoke like someone celebrating a victory. Now she looked like someone trying to understand how a simple land acquisition had become a legal nightmare. For nearly an hour, nobody argued. Instead, documents moved across the table. Historical surveys, original deeds, development plats, recorded agreements, county filings. Karen reviewed page after page while her attorney quietly highlighted specific provisions. Several times, she stopped reading and returned to earlier sections, as if hoping the language would somehow change. It never did. Eventually, she reached the same conclusion every other professional had reached. The problem was not my interpretation. The problem was the paperwork itself. Decades of assumptions had hidden legal provisions that remained valid whether anyone remembered them or not. As the meeting continued, another uncomfortable reality emerged. The HOA had never performed a complete historical review before attempting to acquire my land. They relied on secondary records, incomplete mapping information, and a chain of mistaken assumptions. What began as an effort to expand community holdings had triggered scrutiny that exposed issues affecting the entire subdivision. Karen asked several questions. Richard answered each one calmly, while referencing the supporting documents. The atmosphere felt less like a dispute and more like a history lesson nobody wanted to attend. By the end of the afternoon, Karen understood something that changed everything. The legal leverage connected to those historical rights was real. It had survived multiple ownership transitions, development phases, and corporate changes. More importantly, it remained attached to the successor owner of the original tract. That owner was me. As news continued spreading through the community, residents became increasingly frustrated with the board. Not because of the historical documents themselves, but because nobody had verified the facts before making public announcements about acquiring additional land. Questions that once targeted me now focused squarely on HOA leadership. How had this happened? Why had proper research not been completed? Why were residents learning critical information from title reviews instead of the board? Karen could not answer those questions easily because the answers all pointed toward the same mistake. The deeper people looked, the clearer it became. The HOA's attempt to claim ownership of my property had opened a door that could not be closed again. Every investigation uncovered more supporting evidence. Every review confirmed the same historical chain of ownership. Every professional examination strengthened the record. That evening, as I drove home beneath a sky clearing after the rain, Richard called with one final update. Several independent title experts had completed their own evaluations. Their conclusions matched ours almost exactly. I pulled onto a ridge overlooking my land and watched the last sunlight break through the clouds. Somewhere beyond the distant subdivision lights, Karen was likely reading documents late into the night. For the first time since this began, she finally understood the truth. The land she thought the HOA had taken from me was never the real story. The real story was the community built on legal foundations nobody bothered to examine until they challenged the wrong property owner. The final meeting took place nearly 2 months after I first saw those real estate signs standing on my land. The community clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was occupied. Residents lined the walls and filled the rear of the room. The atmosphere felt completely different from the celebration Karen had hosted weeks earlier. Back then, people believed the community was expanding. Now they were here to understand how everything had gone so wrong. I arrived with Richard carrying several binders containing the same documents that had steadily dismantled the HOA's assumptions. Karen sat at the front of the room beside legal counsel. She looked exhausted, not defeated, just tired in the way people become when reality finally catches up with confidence. As the meeting began, Richard presented the findings in simple language. He walked residents through the historical ownership records, the survey errors, the overlooked deed provisions, and the chain of mistakes that transformed a routine property misunderstanding into a county-wide legal lesson. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The evidence had already been reviewed by independent professionals, title specialists, county officials, and attorneys. The facts were no longer disputed. They were simply accepted. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. A resident stood and asked the question that had hovered over the community for weeks. What happens now? Richard looked toward me before explaining the available legal options. Technically, the historical rights attached to the original property gave me leverage that could have created years of complications for future transfers, approvals, and property transactions within the subdivision. I understood that. Karen understood that. Every homeowner in the room understood that. The power existed. The documents proved it. But power and wisdom are not always the same thing. I stood and addressed the room for the first time. I explained that my dispute had never been with the residents. Most of them had no idea what the HOA was doing. They bought homes, raised families, paid their bills, and trusted leadership to do its job. The problem began when leadership stopped verifying facts and started making assumptions. Then I announced the decision. In exchange for formal recognition of my ownership rights, correction of all public records, removal of every improper claim against my property, reimbursement of legal expenses, and a permanent agreement protecting my land from future interference, I would release the historical leverage that had become the center of the dispute. The room fell silent. Then relief spread across faces throughout the audience. Karen slowly nodded. Her attorney nodded as well. The agreement was finalized over the following weeks. Survey markers disappeared. Promotional materials vanished. Public records were corrected. The signs that had started this entire ordeal were removed from my property. Life gradually returned to normal. Months later, I stood on a ridge overlooking 1,500 acres that still belonged exactly where they had always belonged. The evening wind moved through the grass while sunlight stretched across the fields my grandfather once walked. Looking back, the lesson felt remarkably simple. The HOA thought they could take land because they believed paperwork supported them. In the end, paperwork proved the opposite. People can ignore warnings. People can ignore experience. But they cannot ignore a recorded deed. And that is how a group that tried to sell my land ultimately discovered that the most powerful document in the room was the one they never bothered to read.